There is no possibility of reverting to the pre-pandemic status quo. The reason for this is simple. It was that status quo that produced the pandemic. An increasing likelihood of pandemic was wired into the regime of globalization that developed over the past few decades. But this regime of free market globalization is already history. What I'd like to do now is to point to three features of that regime, which together, along with some other factors, made the pandemic possible and, in the long run, inevitable. The first of these three features is worldwide mobility, the continuous, rapid, systemic mobility of goods, capital, and also, and crucially, human beings. More than at any time in the past, human beings are not sedentary, they're not limited to a small locality or a particular country. They're traveling everywhere all the time, or at least they were before the pandemic. And that, of course, is facilitated by a feature which wasn't present in the pandemic, the influenza pandemic of 100 years ago, mass air transportation, hugely expanded in the last few decades, wasn't present 100 years ago in the influenza pandemic, but was a structural feature of the world economy and world society leading up to our present pandemic. And that has been greatly curtailed by the pandemic, and I think will remain reduced. Global mobility of human beings will be on a lower scale in the future than it was before the coronavirus pandemic. The third feature of the regime of globalization that broke down with the pandemic is, to my mind, possibly the most important, which is the continuous destruction of natural environments by expanding human populations, which removed the habitats, destroyed, desolated the habitats of countless animal species, and thereby allowed viruses to jump more easily to humans. It was that continuing process of environmental destruction, together with the so-called wet markets in Asia and elsewhere in the world of exotic and rare animal species, that made the jumping of viruses, zoonotic viruses jumping from other species to humans, more and more likely, more and more a bigger and bigger risk, and which eventually was bound to produce a pandemic of one kind or another, and in fact produced the one we're still going through. And what the virus has shown, together with abruptly accelerating climate change, which is also going on at the same time, I believe now, has done is to show that this project of a separate human ecosystem, decoupled, detached, insulated from the rest of the planet, is an illusion. That's the deepest meaning of this pandemic. So, having said that, I'll say a little more about how and in what respects the regime of globalization that existed before the pandemic has broken down. It's already broken down. It's already changed. It's already history, actually. As I said right at the start, an historical period to which we can't return because it was that period that produced the pandemic. So what's happening? Well, there are various signs of its morphing into a different kind of system or a set of fragmented systems. Businesses are shortening their supply chains. Governments, for example, that of Japan, are offering incentives to companies to reshore production. In other words, bring them back from remote parts of the world or parts of the world which are politically or in other ways unstable. Strategically important industries are being protected from foreign competition more even than before. Governments everywhere are imposing restrictions on international travel, whether for tourist or business purposes. And maybe this is the biggest change which is underway, a global economic regime based on maximal cost efficiency. That means the cheapest labor and the lowest production costs are what the system prioritized. That's what the system was looking for. It's shifting to one in which governments are trying to make their economies more resilient and more secure. But this isn't a planned move. It's not a move that any of these governments planned, and it's certainly not a move being organized by any international authority. It's just happening, and it's already happened. Different states, different sovereign states, are adopting policies they believe will enhance the security of their citizens, regardless of the impact on the system as a whole. Now, this can be dangerous, obviously. It can promote geopolitical conflict, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But paradoxically, maybe, a more fragmented world could be more stable, more resilient. If everything's linked up to everything else, if every part of the global economy is tightly enmeshed in an enormous system of delicate supply chains and intricate interdependencies, then any disruption to the system will be transmitted everywhere quite quickly, whether it's a pandemic or not, or something else. And the system is actually highly fragile. One of the paradoxes we have to grasp about the world today is that a less integrated, more fragmented system might in the long run be more stable. We're moving into a world in which virtual mobility may be even more on a greater scale than human mobility was, but it'll also be a low contact human world. And this isn't just a matter of cutting back on business travel or the rise of online retail, which have obviously occurred. Education, personal relationships, community life in churches and neighborhoods, and city life will all be more virtual, I think, than they have been in the past. Of course, they can't be completely virtual because human beings haven't evolved to live entirely in a virtual environment, and ways of interacting with each other while preserving social distancing for as long as it's needed, which I think could be a long time, in some forms maybe indefinitely, will have to be devised. But the background have to be worked out. We can't live decoupled from human beings. Families, sexual and love relationships, and some forms of face-to-face community are essential for human beings. So we have to find them. Nevertheless, human beings, I think, are going to live virtually in virtual space more than they've ever done before. This, of course, will have enormous economic implications and consequences and costs. Many industries are destined to shrink or even disappear. Propping up airlines, I think, is futile. We'll need airlines. There'll still need to be international air transportation, but on nothing like the scale before. Even railways in this country, our present government is committed to a vast expansion of rail travel from London to the north of Britain. I think the wisdom of that is very doubtful, apart from its environmental costs and its enormous financial costs, 100 billion or more, it's now estimated. I think working at home will be much more common in future than it has been, partly from necessity, but partly because many people prefer it. Many people will opt for working at home rather than tiresome, exhausting, expensive commutes, especially if a risk of infection continues to exist, even if the virus has been beaten back in many ways. As long as there is a significant risk of infection, then people may prefer to work at home, either completely or at least to travel less than they've done before to work, to go in for 2 or 3 days a week or not at all, rather than make these daily commutes. So we're finding in Britain a tremendous impact on coffee shops. Coffee shops were kind of dependent, reliant on the so-called Pret economy was created by commuting. If commuting is going to be, as I believe it will be, at a much lower level than it's been in the past in Britain and other countries, including the countries of Latin America, then those parts of the economy are just bound to shrink. I think universities, as they currently operate and are constituted, will actually shrink, and many of them will cease to exist, because the kind of face-to-face interaction that they're based on, and which students pay for, and which students go into debt to finance, will not be worth it. If so much of university teaching goes online, as is in fact happening, it'll be a bad bargain. Students won't want it. Many students won't want it. They won't be prepared to pay those kinds of fees. And this brings out a kind of quite important point. We shouldn't think that the costs of the large changes and the costs of the virus come solely from governments, perhaps from the incompetent policies of governments. They do partly. No government has really responded to this in any way that could be described as perfect, certainly not. And they've all made mistakes, I think. But part of the costs, part of the changes, a large part, comes from people themselves, come from below, come from large human populations. They just don't want, for example, to engage in the tiring, exhausting daily commute, 5 days a week, that they did before. They've learned from the lockdowns, which were instituted in many countries against the to protect against the pandemic, that they don't want to live like this again, and they won't go back. Governments won't be able to force them, I don't think. Or if they do force them, which may be happening in China, it won't be popular, and it won't perhaps be all that efficient either. Other phenomena that will develop will be no doubt partly good and partly bad. Robotization in factories will accelerate, and the robotization even of human services, social services, like caring for very old people. I think that will advance too, and that they pose lots of dilemmas, but I think that's what will happen. So the resulting social and economic impact will be large and enduring. It won't, certain trends that were advancing anyway towards robotization, towards a more virtual form of mobility, have been hugely accelerated. Changes that would have taken 5 or more years have occurred in 5 or more months, and they won't be unraveled, they won't be reversed. Governments in many countries want to reverse them, trying to reverse many of them, but they're going against the grain. They're going against the grain of the fact that although many people dislike and resist the limits on their leisure lockdowns entail, at the same time, they don't want to go back to the life of commuting and intensive mobility that existed before the lockdown. And in this process of adjustment, of adaptation, many governments, many political systems, I think, will fall because they're just not capable of dealing with it, of dealing with the adjustments that are required. And as I said from the start, and more than once throughout this, these thoughts, this talk, free market capitalism, really, of the kind, the global kind that existed before, it's really already history. It's gone. Governments have a much deeper interaction, a much deeper involvement in the economy than under that model, which was always partly an illusion, of course. But at the same time, I think central planning isn't a viable option either. It's too far away from local concerns, local communities. It's too much one size fits all, and the plans that are developed are invariably defective. What I think the future lies with is hybrid regimes that mix free markets and various types of government intervention and planning, using new technologies to adjust to a situation in which the old world no longer exists. So in conclusion, if we want to make the post-pandemic world humanly habitable, we have to accept that there's no going back to the world that existed before the pandemic. It's gone forever. We're living in a time of an almost perfect storm. The burning forests in the Amazon, in Oregon, and Australia, and the melting polar glaciers are interacting with the pandemic to really alter the world from which it's, the forms in which it's been, even in my lifetime and in the lifetime of anyone that now lives. So the earlier project of constructing a separate ecosystem, a separate ecoculture, one which is decoupled and insulated from the rest of the planet, that's failed definitively. We have to learn to live in a world in which the human bubble, the bubble that we tried to create, has burst. We have to find ways, different ways in different societies and different communities to live in this new world that has now come into being. Thank you.